Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening, to come over from York. So it's nice to come to a proper historic city, and really good to be with you. So I've been asked to address this question, gender, are there really only two options? Are there really only two options? My basic answer is that there are three genders, there are two sexes, and there's no options. But I'm not going to explain what I mean by that for a while. I am going to be trying to persuade you that that is a good thing. My point really tonight is what I want to do is to compare two different views of our identity, two different views of what you or what any person is. Are we, on the one hand, defined by ourselves so that we can define ourselves as we wish, and therefore, by definition, there are as many options as we like? Or are we defined by God? God has defined who we are for us. Those are the two basic options. The latter option is clearly the Christian idea, but the former one is, of course, where we find ourselves as a culture in Britain, largely. And of course, Christianity is radically different in a culture which now seeks to say that gender is so insignificant that we really can invent what it means for ourselves. Christianity stands in stark contrast to that, because Christianity is gendered from beginning to end. The name of the Christian God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We Christians worship a man, Jesus Christ. The Christian church's most important understanding of herself, and oops, I've just slipped in a gendered term there, maybe you didn't notice, is that she is Jesus' bride. Elders of churches all through the history of the church have been men, not women, with the exceptions limited only to a very few denominations and only very recently in history. And yet churches and the church has always thought of itself as feminine. You cannot avoid gendered language and the issue of male and female within the church, the Christian church. Now, in fact, Christianity, in the opinion of most people today, is actually even worse than that. It's not just that it says there are no options in choosing your gender. You can't choose your identity at all. Who you are is not something that you get a say in. But the surprise, and this is what I want to try and present to you tonight, is that despite what many people assume, it is not Christianity with its emphasis on gender, with its view that our identity is defined for us by God. It is not Christianity that destroys real humanity. Rather, it is the idea that our identity is self-chosen, self-defined, which shatters human society and human individuals into mutually hostile and irreconcilable fragments. It's Christianity that is able to put us back together and give us real wholeness. Now, that's a big claim, and I'm going to have to build a case for it. So two pretty simple halves of what I want to say. I want to talk, first of all, about what I'm going to call the transgender tragedy, although that's covering the whole issue of identity. And then I'm going to talk about the glory of the Christian gospel. Now, I'm well aware that in this room there's going to be a pretty wide range of opinions. That's fine, but it seems to me there's not much point in coming to something like this if I'm not prepared to actually try and persuade you what I think, and if you disagree, that's fine. That's the idea of this evening, isn't it, is that we can discuss those things. So let me start with what I'm going to argue is the transgender tragedy. The basic idea of the LGBT movement is that identity is self-chosen. I've said that already. So that's been the case of the movement from the start, long before anyone thought of the idea of transgenderism. way back in the 1970s with the gay rights movement. The idea of redefining the word gay from its original meaning of being happy and carefree to what it now means is that it is about identity. The identity of a person is defined by his or her feelings. In that case, my sexual attractions define who I am. And all that the transgender idea, which has risen to prominence so recently, it's sometimes hard to remember quite how recently it is, just really in the last 5 years. All it does is to carry that idea consistently into the categories of male and female itself. So not just about my desires of my body, but the very substance of my body. The point being that the idea of an identity that is given to me is considered stifling. And of course, maleness and femaleness are the kind of the ultimate imposed identity. You did not choose your body. It is the ultimate lack of freedom to define yourself. So it's very consistent with the whole movement of thought that has become known as the LGBT movement, although actually it really depends on a philosophical movement called existentialism. That may be a matter for another day. It's very consistent with that to want to throw off the imposition and to say, I'm not going to allow myself to be defined by what other people think. I'm not going to be defined by the expectations of society. I'm not even going to allow myself to be defined and constrained by my own body. And the decision to use the word gender rather than sex in its older meaning of male or female does make this point, because, of course, gender is a concept from linguistics, from languages, and therefore it's rather arbitrary. Ship is feminine in English. We speak of ships as she, but in French, bateau, which means ship, is masculine. So it's an arbitrary thing. We attach those things. And so there, whereas sex is a kind of biological given, by speaking of gender, we can reduce these ideas to mere preference. Fundamentally, there's no difference, you see, between men and women. Now, there's interesting reasons as to why this has been promoted, and I don't have time to treat those now. Do ask about them later if you want to. But you see, the basic idea is that because we are defined not by our bodies, but by the inner me, the feelings, the choices, the preferences inside me, there cannot be any limitation to gender. And the belief that goes along with that is that, therefore, by lifting the society's limitations, we are setting people free to be whoever they want to be. There's an infinite number of options, no one can choose for you, and then everyone will be happy. Now, that is the idea. But I want to say that has some very serious problems. 4 very serious problems. Here's the first one. It has a problem with reality. It has a problem with reality, with the consistency with the facts of our existence. That the privileging of the psychological over the physical, which it cannot be denied that transgenderism is doing, is problematic, to say the least. Let me try and give you an example of this. Years ago, I used to run a summer holiday camp for teenagers. One of the lads who came, who was in the dormitory I was looking after, he was called Aaron, very nice lad. Aaron was obsessed with aliens. It was in the days of the X-Files, some of you who are old enough to remember that program on TV. And Aaron knew everything about every supposed UFO sighting, as far as I could tell, that there had ever been. And the thing is that Aaron was not just a kind of a fan of the X-Files. He genuinely believed that it was true. It was a fictional TV program. But Aaron thought it was a documentary. And he genuinely believed that these things were real. And the only reason that other people didn't was because, there was a big cover-up by the CIA or whoever it was. Now, maybe you've met people like that. The thing is, of course, is that not one of us would ever consider that the seriousness of Aaron's convictions had the slightest effect on reality. Of course not. The fact that a 14-year-old boy believed something passionately and genuinely to be true, and indeed you could say that, and it was true, he would be very upset, and he was very upset when people tried to tell him that it was not true, did not, of course, have any impact on whether the aliens really existed. Now, that seems like a silly example, but it is important to raise it, because the issue of claiming that the reality of someone's identity is defined more by subjective feelings than by objective facts is actually saying nothing different to claiming that the reality of the aliens was defined by the feelings of this boy about it. We live in a world where 14-year-old children are allowed to say, indeed encouraged to believe, that who they are is defined simply by their feelings and not by anything else. But we know it isn't the case, don't we? Last year, the British Medical Association produced new guidance on inclusive language, and it stated this: a large majority of people that have been pregnant or have given birth identify as women. Did you get that? A large majority of people that have been pregnant or have given birth identify as women. We can include intersex men and trans men who may get pregnant by saying pregnant people instead of expectant mothers. This was advice from the NHS. The idea is that the philosophy has been applied entirely consistently, but it has bumped up against the immovable reality of motherhood. What will we do with the fact that actually only half the population are capable of bearing children? You see, there is a problem with reality. That is the first problem. Secondly, it seems to have a problem of self-consistency. The problem of saying that whether you are a man or a woman depends on whether you feel that you are a man or a woman becomes evident when we simply ask the question, what is a man? And if the answer is, well, a man is someone who feels like a man, we haven't got very far. Because it's a little bit like saying, what is a tree? And the answer is, well, it's something that looks like a tree. But the problem with that is if you can't define what a tree is, there's no way of knowing whether something looks like one. If you cannot define what a man is, there's no way of knowing whether someone feels like one. And so the problem is once you say that you want to redefine maleness and femaleness according to feelings, is that it becomes impossible to actually specify what those feelings are. If to feel like a man is what you need to do, then the trouble is, to specify what a man is, you would need to say that a man is, well, I feel like someone who could be a father. But once you've said it, you can say, but you couldn't, because you're not a man. You're not biologically capable of being a father. And you can say the same for a woman. Now, we can see this in several ways. That's one way that self-consistency appears. Here's another. A major part of the argument is the psychological distress experienced by those who feel they don't identify with the sex of their bodies. Now, let me say, Christianity has nothing but compassion for those who suffer in that way, or indeed in any one of the many ways in which people feel a sort of internal fragmentation. I'm going to come to that. Indeed, as we'll see, it is Christianity alone that has an answer to it. But here you see the argument is that the sense of identity is so strong that nothing other than re-identifying and then quite possibly altering the body to conform to it will prevent severe psychological harm. Frequently it is alleged that those who oppose transgenderism are causing suicide. But this seems to be saying that the gender binary between male and female is so strong that it must be affirmed, while also saying that the gender binary is so weak that a state of mind is sufficient to overcome it. Do you see that? You see that the desire to express as this sex, not this one, is so strong that it must be bowed to, for it is so important to be able to identify as one or the other. And yet the difference between the two is so trivial that it takes nothing other than a thought or a feeling to overcome it. See, if male and female are of so little consequence they can be deleted from language, how come it's of such huge consequence that it justifies drastic surgery? Indeed, related to that fact is that the movement seems to be saying that identification of male and female is meaningless, so it should be done away with, while asserting there's a major argument, this is some people so strongly wish to identify it as that. So in that advice from the British Medical Association I quoted earlier on, what the words woman and mother mean have had to be evacuated of all meaning in order to try to claim that men can be mothers. You simply have to redefine the words to mean nothing whatsoever. But worst of all, the only content that can eventually be put on these things is actually the worst sorts of gender stereotypes. Earlier today I watched a video provided to educate children from the charity Mermaids, which campaigns to support and encourage transgender children. And they have an animation to teach children what it means to be male or female. And with a little sort of baby figure in the middle, the masculine one, the male one, is surrounded by pictures of guns, pirates, cars, swords, whereas the girl one is surrounded by cooking, princesses, pink high heels, this sort of thing. Which means that, bizarrely, in trying to say that gender should not be fixed, the movement ends up, in fact, clinging to things that for actually decades, and maybe longer, people have been saying are the very worst things to identify male and female by, that actually have nothing to do with the core identity of male and female. So there's a problem of self-consistency, which leads to the third problem, and these get worse as we go on, which is that this approach to identity, just to remind you, the idea that we can choose who we are, destroys identity itself. If your identity is self-defined, then it and you are fundamentally worthless. Let me explain what I mean. You see, the opinions of one person are, in themselves, worthless. Let me give you an example. There are plenty of people on this planet who believe themselves to be the finest specimen of humanity on the earth. Maybe that's some of you. But of course, the only person who believes that is them. And if you believe that, the only person who believes it is you. I'm sure none of us in this room are so ridiculous. There are people who believe the earth is flat. There are people who believe, like Aaron earlier on, in aliens. You see, opinions are worthless unless they accord with the truth. By definition, the opinion of a single person has no value unless it is founded on an authority greater than their own. And if you want to say to me, well, I don't agree with you, that's just your opinion, then it would seem to me you've just proved my point. An idea originating in my own head, with no connection to the reality of the world out there, is precisely worthless. And this is where this issue starts to get really very significant. If my identity is grounded purely inside me, then actually it has no substance. It evaporates into nothingness. If my identity is what I feel myself to be, then a headache or a bad day in the office is no longer just a headache or a bad day in the office. It potentially entirely destroys who I am, because there is nothing of greater value to define me. Years ago, Douglas Adams lampooned economics by describing an alien race who decided to adopt the leaf, as in from a tree, as their national currency, because it was so easy to get hold of. But of course, a currency founded on nothing is worthless. It's what central banks are for, is to go on convincing us that it's not founded on nothing. Value requires grounding in something. And an identity that is grounded in nothing more than your own opinions is one that ultimately is worthless. Indeed, I think it's worse than that. This view of identity actually shatters human beings into lots of pieces. A few years ago, it became, not very long ago, just a couple of years ago, it became common for primary school children to be introduced to this idea using a character called the gender unicorn. Perhaps some of you may have seen this picture. If you haven't, Google it. You'll very quickly bring it up. The picture of a little cartoon figure of a sort of cheerful, plump unicorn. And then different markers on the unicorn's body illustrated different aspects of this unicorn's identity, all to do with gender in one way. And so it had coming out of the head a bubble, which was a thought bubble, which is your gender identity. And then it had a love heart here, which describes those whom you are physically attracted to. And another one next to it, of those whom you are emotionally attracted to. And then it had a marker of some sort, roughly over this unicorn's crotch, which was said to indicate this is your biological sex. And then fifthly, a bracket embracing the whole unicorn, talking about your gender expression. The point of this being that all these things are unrelated and can be different. Any combination of them is possible. You can have a certain physical attraction, which is your sexual orientation, which goes along with a different gender expression, how you like to dress, and a different thing entirely in your head, whether you feel you're male or female, or neither, or both, or something else that you've come up with. You see, it posited 5 entirely unrelated parts of the character, with no connection or correlation between them. And it doesn't take long thinking about that to realize actually there is something deeply tragic about that. For it presents a person as being made up of fragments which have no inherent connection to one another, shattered into pieces. Your sexual drive, the way that you live, the feelings, thoughts in your head, and the feelings in your heart, just sort of randomly directed elements of yourself, which may or may not have any sort of correlation or alignment. It shatters identity into lots of different pieces. Indeed, the question you may want to ask is, why was a unicorn used? Interestingly, there was an earlier version of the same diagram that was produced, I think, by Stonewall. That was not a unicorn, but was a sort of gingerbread man, but of course it was called the genderbread person. And exactly the same idea, and the same things. But it was replaced with the unicorn because lots of people objected that it appeared too masculine. And the figure needed to be less obviously one gender. But that actually, I think, gives the whole thing away. Why a unicorn? The figure could not be human, you see, because any actual human is unavoidably male or female. You cannot produce a picture of a human being which looks realistically like a real human being without it being clear that this human is male or female. The only way to produce this entirely generic figure was to dehumanize it entirely. And that really goes now pretty deep to the core of the Christian concern about this. Christians are concerned about the issue not because we want to deny people an identity, but rather that we are so desperately concerned that this rips away any real identity at all. An identity constructed based on how you feel is a house of cards built on thin air with no internal consistency and no strength to survive any kind of challenge. It leaves people with no real identity, which leads to the final concern. The final concern is that this damages real people. The shattering of the self that goes along with a self-created identity has drastic consequences. None is worse than the basic premise that who you are has no fundamental connection to your body. Now, ever since the 70s, gay rights, and as it later became known, the LGBT movement, had set people against the purpose of your bodies. What your body is designed to do tells you nothing about what you should do with them. We're not supposed to behave in the way that we are apparently made to behave, but rather by what we want to do. But transgender goes further, though consistently, to say it sets us against the actual substance of our bodies. It tells us that our bodies are potentially our enemy. It can be a prison preventing you from being who you really are. You can be trapped in the body of a girl or a boy, etc. And when this comes down to telling children this, it gets desperately serious. To tell people of any age, but especially those who are young and impressionable, that their bodies are an enemy which needs to be escaped from or redesigned, a solution involves hormones and surgery, that this becomes very, very serious. What would have been called less than a decade ago, and in any other culture, poisoning and mutilation, is now called treatment with hormones and gender reassignments. But it is not fundamentally different. You see, if the transgender case is right, then each of us knows of ourselves, and what we think we know of ourselves is somewhere between illusion and disaster. All the things that give us value in life, mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, all the relationships of our families, that they become terms with no meaning, as we've seen. We're all just ultimately neuter things, and everything else is social construct. Far from affirming humanity, the idea that we choose our identity diminishes, fragments, and destroys our humanity. That is why I've called it the transgender tragedy. I speak very clearly and openly as a Christian, and that very definitely is a Christian view of where this takes us. But I think I've said enough about that. Let me, therefore, move on to talk about the glory of the Christian gospel. Christianity, as I said, has a totally different approach. It's one that sees male and femaleness as not only an unchangeable part of who we are, but designed as part of who we are to teach us about who we are. We worship a God who became a man, a physical, biological man. A God who became a man who is one person, his divine nature united to a human body and soul in perfect integration in his male body. Christians can never imagine that who we are is divorced from our body. What's more, his human nature is forged in the womb of a woman. He was born of a woman. The sex nature of humanity is essential for Christianity, and it is glorious for Christianity. Let me go back to our question. Gender. Are there really only two options? I've said at the beginning, well, as a Christian, we would need to say there are three genders, two sexes, and no options. Why three genders? Because gender is a linguistic term. Every language, anyone who studied languages knows that there is masculine, feminine, and neuter. There are three genders that apply to words in languages, and indeed that apply to things. But there are only two sexes because no person can ever be neuter. There is no such thing as an it, which can be called a person. We use it for stones and worms, but not for men, women, and children. God designed us as such. There are two sexes, and there are no options, for God made us as such. I want to show us a few verses in the Bible to kind of show how this works. Genesis chapter 1, the very beginning of the Bible, introduces us to these things. I think this verse is going to come up on the screen, I think. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. You see, God made us. We do not choose what we are. Our identity is defined for us by our Creator. And freedom does not come from escaping from the nature God's given us. There's the verse. But rather from living in conformity with it. Just as freedom for a fish doesn't come from escaping from the water, but from living in it, in accordance with its nature. There are no options when it comes to who we are, and our sex is one, though not the only one, of those things. We don't get to choose our sex any more than we get to choose our planet or choose our species. We are what God has made us, and that is not a bad thing, for we are made in the image of God. Our identity is founded on that. What you are is not some amorphous stuff that you must shape yourself into something or choose what you want to be. What you are is designed by the all-powerful, perfect, infinite God to be like him and to reflect his majestic nature. You are designed to be like the King. That is the first thing to see here. Here's the second. It's in Genesis 2. Verse 7, here it is. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. We are bodies and souls. To be human is to be more than an animal, but not to be less. You see, that word, the man became a living creature, the word for living creature is the same as the word for soul, as is often used in the rest of the Bible. That when God made us, he made us, yes, we're made of dust, we have bodies, and we also have something breathed into us, which is far more than a body. Your body is you, and so is your soul, and the two are one. You are not two halves struggling to live in harmony. You are one, made up of a body and a soul. Now, when you put that together with what we saw in that previous verse, if we can go backwards, Genesis 1:27, here it is. God created man in his own image. The image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God made us to be like him, but his image is always in male or female. The difference is inherent in our humanity. There is a divide amongst the human race between male and female. They are different, inescapably different. They are both equally God's image, but they can never be the same as one another. Now, why would God make us that way? Well, the clue comes just in the second chapter of the Bible. Let's put those verses up as well. Genesis 2, a slightly longer bit here. This is where we first meet the issue of men and women, although we've been told we have male and female before. Let me read this out. The Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." God has designed mankind to be these two different, male and female, but he has designed them to come together in permanent and glorious union. The permanent intertwining and intermingling of themselves is an irreversible union of two persons, body and soul. Sexual union is the profound expression of that, but it flows out into every part of their lives. Male only means something in relation to the female, who is his opposite. And female only means something in relation to the man. That is how God has designed us. And the union of the two, the permanent union, as God designed us for, lives on forever in the flesh and blood of their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. That is why Christianity sees sex outside the marriage of a man and a woman as being as gruesome and unnatural as ripping the beating heart out of a body. Maleness and femaleness means two profoundly different, separated by an uncrossable divide, because it goes to the core of who they are, who are nevertheless made for everlasting union as father and mother. Let me put this into personal terms. Your body speaks of God designing you to be united to a spouse of the opposite sex and a truly permanent union in your children. Now, that's true whether or not you have or ever have any children. Your body speaks of that design. That carries obligations to act in line with it, even if we don't want to. But God has designed us this way in order to teach us something critical. And why should that be? Well, there's a hint here in this part of the Bible, and indeed all the way through it, which is very simple, that God is always called he. God in the Bible is always masculine. In the very verse which we read earlier on, the first time that male and female are mentioned, God 3 times is called he. You see, God designed us as male and female who have to relate to one another as different but destined to be united, because he wants us to know that he designed us to be different to him but destined to be united. It's one of the Bible's biggest pictures and ideas that God sent his son to earth in order to win a bride for himself. And his bride is not one human woman. It is all the peoples of the earth united in returning to loyalty to the living God. The Christian church is the bride of God, the bride of Jesus Christ. You see, male and female are not an invention of culture or an idea that people came up with. They're something God has hardwired into us so that we would know who we are and we would know how to be whole. And we would know we can only be whole when we allow God, in the person of Jesus Christ, to come and claim us as his bride, as his wife, to become into union with him. Your body, you see, is both a gift and a signpost. It speaks of how God has destined you for a better future, and it tells you how to get there, to surrender to the masculine God who alone can bring life to you and through you. Now, there's far more I could say about that. But let me end really by saying this. Why does this have to happen through Jesus? Why did God send his son to become man? And the answer is because, just as we saw in the transgender thing, but actually in 1,000 other ways in human society, we are shattered, fragmented people, not at peace with our bodies, not at peace in our souls, fighting within ourselves and between ourselves. And the reason for that is that we have spent our lives treating God as if we did not need him to be whole. We have been, as the author C.S. Lewis once said, like females trying to have children with no father. We can't do it. And we have brought destruction on ourselves. But God sent Jesus Christ to re-establish us, to reintegrate us. Christians are not surprised that the world is full of people who feel that their bodies don't agree with who they feel they are, or their feelings don't fit with other things, and feel profoundly uncomfortable with life or circumstances and indeed themselves. God sent Jesus Christ. And he made us male and female to point us to Jesus Christ, because in him and him alone can we become whole. So are there only two options? Well, there are only two sexes, male and female. We have no option, each of us, which we are. But that is very, very good news, because it points us to the one and only way to become whole. I've said quite enough, and I'm going to stop. Scott, let me hand back to you.
Okay, we've worked through the questions and tried to group them as best we can. So like last time, I might not ask all the questions, but we'll get into the rough ballpark. So there are a number of questions relating to the physical side of things. What is the Christian view or attitude towards babies born as intersex or with ambiguous genitalia, all that kind of issues? How should Christians come alongside these people? Is the physical reality of our gender only determined by those things? So we'll begin with that.
Okay, that's a really good question. I think it's a very helpful question because I think it clarifies the issue quite a lot. The question of intersex conditions, which is very often raised in connection with transgenderism, is almost exactly the opposite issue, as in it profoundly is an entirely different thing, because one is about people's feelings being at odds with healthy bodies and wanting to adjust or alter healthy bodies, or indeed simply to deny the reality of them, even if they're not seeking to change them. Whereas intersex condition is about a medical, physical issue. Now, Christianity is very, very clear and has a very clear understanding of both what is going on with physical illness and why it has come about, which is that the whole thing I said earlier on about how because of our rejection of God, we are fragmented people, and that causes all sorts of problems in every part of our being, body and soul. So therefore, we are not at all troubled by the reality. It's very rare, but it is a reality of some children born with disorders of sexual development, as they are medically known. And it's very clear that these are medical issues. It's very easy to see that it's clear they're medical issues because infertility in adults is a medical issue. That is not debated. If you're not infertile, then by definition there is no question about whether you are male or female, because male and female is, by design, is all about generating children. And so therefore, by definition, a condition which makes you infertile is in some sense a medical issue. It may or may not be solvable. And so clearly an intersex issue it is not something which can be seen as anything other than a physical disorder, which, like all other physical disorders, if it can be treated, should be. And of course, not all illnesses can be treated, but often it should. But it really has nothing at all to do with the issue of what do we do with healthy bodies when someone psychologically or emotionally or maybe simply by choice doesn't want to conform to what the body is. So it's really a very, very different thing. If the question is how should we relate to those things, and the answer is, as Christians always have towards those who are sick or struggling in body, mind, or spirit, is to be full of compassion and do all we can out of mercy, both to help where we can and to offer support and mercy where treatment is beyond what's possible. There's a related question, which I think one of the questions was: is our sex only to do with our genitalia? To which the answer to that, well, biologically, is massively no. Whether you are a man or a woman is written into every cell of your body. The idea of there being a female brain in a male body, or as one BBC documentary put it, I have a girl brain even though I've got a boy's body, it is simply nonsense. Every cell of that brain either has XY chromosomes or XX chromosomes. And so the brain is as gendered in every cell as the entirety of the rest of the body. Now, of course, again, there are disorders where those things don't work quite as they should, but they're disorders by definition, and they need to be dealt with.
Okay, following on from that then, someone asked, is it ever possible to switch sex? Would a person who changed sex still be the sex they were created as?
And the answer to that is a very simple no to the first question and yes to the second. It is not possible to switch sex, and someone who thought they had changed sex has not done so genuinely. We are not made by, we're not such creatures that we can genuinely change what we are. Cosmetic surgery does not genuinely change you into something different. A while ago, the BBC ran an article on extreme cosmetic surgery and had a chap who'd had surgery to make him look like a parrot. But he didn't become a parrot, he just now looked like one, and he looked pretty horrific. And drastic as it seems to say, although actually to every previous generation of human beings before our own, it does not make you a woman either to dress like one or to surgically adjust your body to look like one if you're a man. Every single cell of your body still knows that that is what you are. And there have been plenty of cases where this has been demonstrated, lots of documented medical cases. And the evidence for how effective transitioning is to say it is patchy, is minimal. But in a sense, that evidence is almost irrelevant. In terms of what we are, we don't get to choose. It is strange that culturally we've become utterly horrified by the idea of impersonating someone of a different race. And the idea of people, of white actors dressing in blackface is rightly considered grossly offensive. But actually, transgenderism is not fundamentally different to that. And I think it is worth saying that.
I think leading on from that, there's a group of questions about people being hardwired from birth to be gay or straight. Mm-hmm. What would you say to that?
So Lady Gaga's song, Born This Way, is of course the anthem of that idea that we're born to be either gay or straight. The interesting thing about the song is that, I can't sing it certainly, and I'm not sure I can even quote it, but Baby I Was Born This Way, is that Lady Gaga is not speaking about her body, she's speaking about her feelings. And that itself is exceedingly interesting, that the assumption of the song and the assumption of Western people as they hear it is that it doesn't occur to anyone that it could be referring to her body. But the answer is, why not? Like, Baby I Was Born This Way could certainly refer to the chromosomal makeup of your cells, and actually it would make an awful lot more sense if it did. Biblically, there is absolutely no, and in the whole of Christian thought, the idea that the way we are born is a valid basis for thinking. So the way we are born, where our feelings are naturally, is a valid basis for how we should behave or who we are, is very far from the case, actually. Rather, we are deeply disordered creatures. Our feelings would lead us and would define us in all sorts of terrible ways. And of course, that's what we love to do. We love to define ourselves in different ways. But that is the fundamental problem of humanity, is that we think we can reinvent ourselves, but actually we have been defined, designed, and identified by God before we were born. And that is a joyfully liberating thing to realize. So therefore, to answer the question, the idea, are people hardwired to be gay or straight from birth? We have all sorts of wrong wiring inside us, which gives us all sorts of wrong desires from as early as you can remember. Any of you who've got young children will know that. Your children were born with lots of desires to do things they shouldn't do. But the glory of what Jesus Christ came to do is to restore us to what we were really designed and intended to be. And that is a very great relief. And so Christians would never want to identify ourselves by our desires, however strong they may or may not be. Instead, we discover that God has identified us beforehand as something vastly better, and he calls us to relearn what we were made to be and to become, through his work and his Spirit, what we're really destined to be. But I'm getting onto a bigger topic there.
Thank you. So there's a number of questions about it. If we've got this glorious gospel and we recognize the tragedy, I think, how do we engage when society at large, and particularly the media, education, they're all pushing in a certain direction? So mm-hmm. how do we engage well with that?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really important question. So that's clearly a question that's asked from a Christian viewpoint. So those of you present who aren't Christians, you're kind of now being asked to listen in to my answer to how the way that Christians should think about this. But actually, it'd be quite helpful for you to hear the answer as well as those of you who are Christians. How do we engage? As there is always one answer to that, all the way through the Bible, as to how we engage with the world, which is that A, we're faithful ourselves, and B, we proclaim the good news to the world around us. So the first part of it, we're faithful ourselves, is that we're never given permission to disobey God just because other people around us think we should. And God's commands are very simple. And one of God's commands is that we should always tell the truth. The way it's stated in the Bible is, you shall not bear false witness. And transgenderism is simply an example of bearing false witness. It's just saying something that isn't true. And the fact that we're being asked very strongly to say something that isn't true and to affirm something that isn't true doesn't mean that we as Christians have permission to do so. We are we are answerable to a much higher authority over the truthfulness of our own tongues than anyone else's. And that's one of the reasons why, as Christians, we should not simply be willing to say, well, it's your decision, I'll do whatever you say. We all live in the universe God has given, and we have to answer to God for whether we've told the truth or not. So that's challenging, and there'll be lots of things we need to think through on how to do that. But we will never have the excuse that, well, it was tough to tell the truth, so I didn't need to. So that's kind of if you like, the tricky bit. Another part of that is, it would be quite wrong to describe this issue as something that other people do, and that gives us a problem. Rather, this is simply one illustration of the fact that all human beings find that the feelings of their hearts are not in line with the reality of the universe we live in, the God we serve, and the bodies he's given us. It's just one example of that. Now, some of us, maybe some of us in this room, will experience exactly this. And you know what it's like to feel that you kind of wish that you could be different, or you have strong desires to do things with your body which you know you shouldn't. And indeed, all of us have that. There may not be sexual desires, although actually for most of us that probably is true to some extent. There's plenty of other desires too. Our job is to be willing to submit the longings of our hearts to the good design of the good God, who tells us what we really are and tells us to stop trying to imagine we can reinvent ourselves as something else. So that's the second thing Christians have got to do. But then the third thing is we need to speak to the world. And actually, this is not nearly as difficult as most Christians think it is, in that this is an issue which enables us to speak really straightforwardly of why it is fantastic to be a Christian. Okay, and that views of the world that are not Christian always end up shattering people into fragments. And this does this issue, the whole LGBT thing it does, but actually the whole of the Western secular atheist way of looking at the world is horribly destructive of human nature. It tells human beings, fundamentally you're worthless. You just need to follow your heart and everything will be okay. But actually, that leads you into disasters, and it sets you at odds with yourself. And what Jesus Christ comes to do is to say, come back to the living God. I have taken away all of the curse of all these things you've done, and I have provided a way for you to be reintegrated into a whole person. And that is a brilliant message we have to a world which doesn't even know what a human being is. If you're a Christian, all your friends and family who aren't Christians don't know who they are. And Jesus not only will tell them, but will remake them, just like he's remaking you to be who you really should be. And this is really, really good news. And we shouldn't be ashamed of telling people. We've got to be ready for the fact that people don't like to hear the gospel. So, yeah, we'll suffer for it. But that's a minor detail compared to the glory of what Jesus offers.
It's brilliant. And as you said, Christian people tell the truth. So I can't ask any more questions because I always said that we'll finish at 9:15 at the latest. And it is 9:15 now. So thank you very much. If you didn't get your question answered, I'm sure Matthew will be willing to hang around for a little bit. Let's show our appreciation again for you guys. Thank you.